2 weeks tomorrow since the tragedy up in Stockport and the violence which sadly followed, and hundreds of people involved are now being hauled before the courts. As a top prosecutor has warned, some could face up to 10 years in prison.
Yeah, but the anger still hasn't gone away. An anti-racism protest, that's anti-racism, it was in London yesterday. That turned heated as 2,000 protesters gathered outside Reform headquarters, where GB News reporter Charlie Peters was with his cameraman.
Don't touch me! Don't touch me! I will... He's touching me!
Film it, Stevie. Film it. Get your stuff. Get it back. Get it back.
I'm not putting it back. My job is your safety. No. Yeah. Is that your bag?
Yes.
Listen to them.
Isn't it funny how some people who are spouting this sort of bile and saying horrible things have sort of peace and love on their T-shirt or something?
Yes. Often the way.
Ironic.
I get it with some of the most horrific abuse I get on Twitter. When you look at the people's... I always look at their profile, and often they claim to be peace-loving vegan activists or something.
Yeah.
Save the animals, be kind.
Yeah,
all
it would just be horrible to you.
It'd be really horrible to you.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, it all comes as police investigations move online. They're trawling through social media accounts of influencers and rioters, searching for posts which may have incited or encouraged violence or spread disinformation.
So we're joined now by political commentator John Oxley. A very good morning, John. Well, do you think this is going to have an effect when we read the accounts now, and they're big in the press, and the police are giving all the details and everything, that if you say something vile online or incite hatred or whatever, you will be found and shamed and possibly even sent to jail. Do you think that is going to have an effect?
I think absolutely. I think we've seen with these protests, people, whether deliberately or whether they've got carried away with the excitement of the moment and what they were feeling, have been quite. Some have been quite radical in what they've been saying, and some have crossed those boundaries. And I think if we start seeing there are real consequences for this, and it looks like police and prosecutors are going to take it very seriously, I think it's only natural that people are going to be chilled a bit by it, and that's probably going to apply to some of the illegal things people are saying, but also potentially some of the legitimate things that people will just be worried about whether they're crossing the line or not, because if you're not well versed in the law, it's quite hard to know where those lines are.
Well, I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? And there is clearly some sense if you're inciting violence, but we don't know where the legal threshold is. And the idea of spreading disinformation, although, I mean, there is a concern, there's a legitimate concern behind it, but at what point does it become a bit 1984?
I think, and what I'd like to see is hopefully with this idea of disinformation is really you have to start looking at intent and what people meant by it. Because I think it is one thing, for you to go online and say something you genuinely believe is true. And another thing, if you are someone particularly, foreign agents or disruptive people here who are going on with the exact purpose, fully knowing that they are saying something entirely untrue with the intention of riling people up. And that feels to me a little bit different. And hopefully that's where the legal distinction will start to fall.
It's very interesting that police are going to the trouble, I presume specialist police are going to the trouble now, of looking at things that were posted online, maybe retweeted, as it were, but they're going right back to try and find the very first tweet. In other words, the person who kicked it all off. And there are several cases now waiting to be heard at court where they've done just that.
Yes, so that is something, clearly the message coming out at the moment is they sort of want to make an example of people who were starting all of this, who are really at the very first iteration of these untruths. I suspect technologically that's relatively easy to track those people down. And those are the people we're starting to see arrested now. It'll be interesting to see, how this proceeds and whether people a bit lower down the list are prosecuted, whether they're charged, whether they receive a caution or a warning as well, and how widely the police and the CPS decide it's in the public interest to go with people who are at the source of this stuff.
It raises, it seems slightly crazy that you then have to say, well, could you be prosecuted or even just warned for retweeting something? If are we going to see cases of people being accused of retweeting stuff that they knew was untrue, but they did it with a certain intent? It gets a bit mind police.
It does, and I think we have to look very carefully at what the police are doing and what the CPS are doing as citizens, and we need to always remember the importance of free speech, and particularly where things are quick moving, people might make innocent mistakes. I suspect with things like retweeting, the police will be really looking at people who are doing it serially, people who are really amplifying this stuff, and again looking at that idea that they knew they were doing it to rile people up. But we really need to be careful that people who were legitimately just interacting with news online don't get caught in this web. It's very dangerous to start arresting people for what they say. There is a distinction when they're doing it to try and cause or incite a disturbance, but you have to be very precise where you do that. Otherwise, people, it becomes a very slippery slope very quickly.
Yes, I suppose that they're making a point here, aren't they? Because they're trying to stop similar behaviour. There's one instance. There's a woman in jail right now waiting for her court appearance. She's the wife of a Tory councillor, and she went on X and posted something that really clearly the police say is inciting violence. She wrote, "Mass deportation now. Set fire to all the hotels, full of the for all I care. If that makes me racist, so be it." She has since totally apologised. And she says now that acting on information that I now know to be false and malicious, and in a moment of extreme outrage and emotion, I posted words that I realise were wrong in every way. But she's been told that she's got to stay in custody. She was refused bail because the magistrates, I think, said that this is just too serious to let you have bail, and you need to stay in custody until we can deal with you properly. They're coming down very, very tough. But it is giving out a message to the rest of the world, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, and fundamentally, I don't think we want people going online and telling other people to burn down people's properties. That is not a good thing to be happening. Whether we need to prosecute everyone who does that, I think more generally, there is kind of this feeling that social media does often bring out the worst in people. People get carried away. But, we've seen, particularly with some of these things about, burning down hotels and buildings, if you're in one of those properties and there's someone online telling, encouraging other people to burn it down, that's a very distressing position to be in. And it's not something we want doing. And if it warns people off that sort of behaviour, then it's probably not the worst thing in the world.
Well, look, obviously something of that nature is very disturbing. However, on some of the, I don't know, can you call it lighter stuff? But we, as well as sort of prosecuting or looking at that angle of things, we've also got to look at us, haven't we, as individuals, and try and teach people to have some critical thinking, to try and assess stuff that they read online rather than just believe it all.
Yes, and I've said for a while, when we talk about online harms, most of the harms we're actually talking about are things that are offline. It's people. It's the way we engage with stuff we see circulating online. And more broadly, it's about, people who get very angry, people who maybe don't have the best relationships. There's a much broader context to people who get misled by false things, or people who get whipped up by some of the extremes on all sides of online. And I think we need a bigger sort of conversation and sense of how do we deal with that? How do we as individuals take responsibility for both what we are saying and how we react to what we are reading online. I think you're entirely right.
Okay, John, good to see you this morning.
Good
Thank
morning.
you very much indeed. My only concern with it, and I do think the internet needs to be policed, my only concern is that I don't know how you can possibly do it, and what are the unintended consequences of this? Are there going to be people who are innocently saying things or retweeting things that then at some point can be hauled up and said, oh, you were spreading disinformation?
I think people just need to understand, which they clearly don't, is that when they put something online, they're publishing. And as journalists, we're very... I mean, when you're trained as a journalist, it is absolutely sort of the root of everything you're trained in is the fact that you're publishing material, and that carries with it responsibility and consequences. And
that's why I get really annoyed. A few years ago, I was asked about, isn't it wonderful that we have all this citizen journalism? And they were gobsmacked when I said, no, I think it's dreadful. Because these aren't journalists. They don't, they can say anything without consequence, and people just believe it. You've got to be careful where you get your news from.
Yeah.
Get it from us.
Yes, absolutely. Well, they're going to be, but apparently there are plans to sort of teach this critical thinking in schools now.
Yeah, they absolutely.
And I think that's a brilliant idea, because you've got generations now of youngsters growing up who are totally used to being able to publish what the heck they want to and say anything. And I think it is about time we taught them about the responsibility of publishing.
Yeah.